Hello! It's been a while since we've had a new video here, but finally we're back and we're ready to go. We have today the Spanish-American War. Before we get going, I want to send a shout out to one of my longtime subscribers, Franklin Mejia. Franklin, if you get this notification and you see it, I know it's been a while since you were in my class. I hope you're doing really well. Anyway, let's go ahead and get started here. So, the Spanish-American War is going to take place in the late 1800s. And so let's start talking about Spain's empire. What's going on with them? By the time you get to 1890, what had at one point been New Spain has collapsed into small holdings around the world, small islands, small cities, depending on where they are. And so Spain is essentially a very weak empire. And despite the fact that they're pretty weak, Cuba, over here in the Caribbean, that's kind of like the crown jewel of the Spanish Empire. They wanted to maintain Cuba kind of above all else. The problem for Spain is the people in Cuba, being so close to Latin and South America, they've been inspired by their revolutions. And so throughout the 1800s, the people in Cuba had staged their own revolutions. And unfortunately for them, they had been unsuccessful. Now, by the time you get to 1895, this guy named Jose Marti, he is going to lead another revolution in Cuba. This one was on the path to at least have more success than the other ones had. So the Spanish sent this guy, Valeriano Weyler, to become the governor of Cuba, and his orders were to make sure that they were able to stamp out the rebellion. In prosecuting the rebellion, which, if you don't know, that's where the government goes out and tries to stop the rebellion, he's going to introduce a couple different things. One of them was called the Reconcentrario. And what that is, it literally translates as reconcentration camp. And if you heard something else in there, yeah, that's what it is. It is a concentration camp. In its original iteration, what they were going to do is they were going to take Cuban villagers who, as far as the Spanish were concerned, were loyal to Spain, and they were going to remove them from their, at this point, ancestral village and relocate them to an area where Spanish forces could protect them from the revolution. So they're uprooting you from your land, moving you miles away, and forcing you to live in a camp, which ends up being unsanitary. The economic opportunities are zero for your own good. All that ended up doing was actually increasing the number of people who wanted to be a part of the rebellion. People were escaping the Reconcentrarios, going to find the rebellion and say, how do I join you? Right? Now, the other methods that he uses, interrogation techniques against suspected revolutionaries, searches of people's belongings and houses, are going to earn him the nickname Butcher. So if you ever hear about Butcher Weyler, that's who he is. In the meantime, in the United States, there's something going on called yellow journalism. Yellow journalism is sensationalist news stories, exaggerated news stories. At this point in time, some of them are flat out made up news stories. The whole purpose of it was to sell papers. Okay? Do not forget, this takes place during the time of the Gilded Age. And so, in the Gilded Age, one of the big businesses is the newspaper industry. We didn't cover it during the rest of the Gilded Age notes, but it is a big business. Two of the largest business owners in the Gilded Age for newspapers are William Randolph Hearst, and one of his major papers was the New York Journal, and his competitor, Joseph Pulitzer, whose major paper was the New York World. Both of these guys, their papers ran the yellow journalism. Pulitzer was a little bit more in the, it needs to be hard, real news. But when your competition is doing it and your competition is starting to outsell you, You find out what they're doing and you do it too. So both of these media owners and a lot of the media around the country, they saw in Cuba the rebels as being sympathetic. So most of the news stories they run are actually on the side of the rebels. And ultimately, the media is going to push the idea that the United States should declare war on Spain. And their whole reasoning would be that it was our duty to free Cuba, to liberate the poor, oppressed Cuban people from the evil Spanish monarchy. Right? If you look at this cartoon right here, Uncle Sam looking on as Spain and Cuba fight, and this cartoon is saying, we need to get in there. We need to break that up. Okay? Now, that's their official reason for why we needed to declare war. Ulterior motive, that motive that exists beneath the surface, was that these newspaper owners knew that war sells. And they knew that a war between the United States and Cuba would have the effect of increasing circulation, and so they would make more money. Right? So there is the profit motive in their call for war. So how did we end up going to war with Spain? Well, to begin with, you have the newspaper owners, publishing the stories, and some of them were factual, and a lot of them were exaggerated. But Butcher Weiler deserves his name. And so pressure from the newspapers was put on President McKinley. And President McKinley, at the beginning, he sought diplomatic solutions. And I've read things from both sides that McKinley didn't want war, that he was kind of pulled into the war with Spain. Other things that he went willingly. Okay? There's definitely an element in the United States government that is pushing him to declare war. He has the ability, though, to delay. And so some of the things that I've read, I've said that his goal was to kind of wait out the people that wanted war until maybe things would change. So at first, he puts a lot of diplomatic pressure on Spain and demands a couple of things from them. One, that they remove Weiler. That McKinley would say that his actions were stirring up the American public, and he needed to be removed. Second, whoever came in to replace him needed to end the reconcentrarios, because we had decided that they were, they don't use the word back in the day, but today we would probably say crimes against humanity. And lastly, he demanded that Spain give Cuba something called home rule. Home rule would be where Cuba would have a lot more authority over their own territory and politics and laws. It's not independence. It's just maybe a couple steps below that. Right? And so he demands these three things of Spain. And Spain, to their maybe credit, they agreed. The leader of the Spanish parliament, the premier, he agreed to these terms. The Spanish government was afraid that the United States was getting ready to declare war, and so they wanted to avoid that. However, the American public is not going to be satisfied. In 1898, there's this thing discovered called the Delome letter. Delome is the Spanish ambassador to the United States. He was writing to a friend talking about what was going on in the United States and what was going on with Cuba. And in his letter, he criticizes the rebellion who, if they're granted actual home rule, these are the guys that are going to end up in charge. And he criticizes their idea to lead. Are they going to be good leaders? Are they going to be good for Spain? That's normal stuff. What he adds in at the bottom of the letter is a personal criticism of McKinley, and essentially describes McKinley as a weak and ineffective leader who is being told what to do and doesn't actually make decisions for himself or for the country. He sends this off. A copy of it ends up in Cuba, and during a raid on a building, the Cuban rebels find this letter, and eventually they're going to get it to William Randolph Hearst. And he would publish it word for word in his newspaper. This is not some conspiracy or something that's made up by Hearst. This is an actual letter. Delome cops to it. Yeah, I wrote it. And the problem is that it angers the American public. Okay? People start viewing this as an insult, not only to the president, but to our entire country. This may be hard for us to understand in 2022. People going around insulting the president and part of the people in America not caring. But we have kind of a thing throughout U.S. history, and that is, I can insult our president because I'm the voter. He's my guy. I can say whatever I want. You're not from America. You don't get to do it. And so there are people who are angry over this. Some of them start using this as the excuse of why we need to go to war. Now, McKinley, to his credit, this is not an excuse for him to want to declare war. You saw the picture of him. He's a big guy. He's had a couple of cheeseburgers. He's not worried about that. What ends up pushing the issue is an incident involving the USS Maine. Okay. By this point, you should have already gone through the notes on the United States building a brand new, modern, powerful Navy. The USS Maine is one of our brand new, modern battleships. And it was sent to Cuba in January of 1898. Its official reason for being in Cuba was so that there would be an American warship in place just in case it was necessary to evacuate Americans or protect Americans that were living in Cuba due to the revolution. What this really is something we call a fly the flag mission. Literally, if you have the imagery of that battleship steaming into Cuba, flying the American flag, and what it's doing with this fly the flag mission is just letting everybody know that the United States is paying attention. We are watching what's going on in Cuba. We are going to make sure that everybody is above the board and everybody is doing what they're supposed to and living up to whatever agreements, okay? But also that we're keeping an eye on the situation. We still do things like this. Okay? When China flexes its muscle in the South China Sea, we will send a fleet to just sail through the area, just to let everyone know, hey, we're paying attention. Well, in 1898, while the Maine is in Havana Harbor, on February 15th, the Maine is going to explode. This catastrophic explosion that destroys the battleship, killing over 260 sailors. Okay? And so this incident becomes the catalyst for our declaration of war against Spain. Because immediately one of the first questions is, what happened? Who sank the Maine? Why did this explosion happen? The newspapers, Hearst, Pulitzer, all the others, they will pick up the story and they will very quickly blame the Spanish. This was done on purpose. Many of the headlines are going to say that the Maine was destroyed by a torpedo, which today we would refer to as a mine, a water mine. You may be familiar with the movie Finding Nemo, where they're running from the sharks, and you have the things that every once in a while kids will describe as, oh, the balloons. Well, they're not balloons, they're mines. And if your ship brushes up against it, it'll set off an explosion. And so the newspapers blame the Spanish for this. Now, in the intervening years, after looking at eyewitness accounts and trying to find out exactly what happened, it is now believed with almost 100% certainty that the explosion originated on board the Maine. It wasn't an exterior explosion that suddenly did something like, say, set off the magazine where they store all the ammunition, but that it was an explosion that started inside. Okay? What caused that explosion? At this point, who knows? Perhaps one of the Maine was steam powered. Maybe one of the boilers ruptured. Okay? There was an electrical system on board the Maine. Maybe there was a short, and maybe there were sparks somewhere in the magazine where the ammunition is kept. But it was a catastrophic accident. Unfortunately for the Spanish, the newspapers initially blaming them fires up the American public. And the American public will demand that we go to war. And so on April 20th, 1898, the Congress of the United States, after being asked by the president and debating, Congress votes to declare war on Spain. Now, not everybody in America is on board with the idea of this war. We do have opponents of this war. Okay? Those people are mostly made up of folks that we call anti-imperialists. One of them is this guy. Maybe you recognize him, William Jennings Bryan. Right? William Jennings Bryan and the anti-imperialists, they argued, number one, this war would be about imperialism, and imperialism was flat out wrong. Imperialism is something the Europeans do. It's not American. In America, we have ideas about freedom and equality, and all this war is about, in their mind, was taking over Cuba and just the Cuban people trading one set of rulers for another. And so they felt that this was wrong. Secondly, they said the United States was not prepared for this war. Okay? We typically, in the United States, we don't have a large standing army. And so they said, if we declare war, we're not going to be ready. We don't have soldiers, we don't have supplies. It will take too long for us to get ready, and it will be pointless. The third thing is, they said the United States did not have the ability to fight what is going to have to be a war around the world. Spain, of course, has possessions in the Caribbean, but they also have possessions in the Pacific. Spain is located in Europe, and so if we really wanted to prosecute this war, we would have to fight around the world, and we didn't have the technical ability to do that. And so for all these reasons, people are opposed to the war, in addition to just the general idea of people who are pacifists who believe that war is fundamentally and morally wrong. Now, the people that support the war, they're going to respond to all of these objections, and they're going to say, look, the war is not about imperialism. The war is about freeing Cuba and liberating that island from Spanish rule. In fact, McKinley comes to Congress and he says, here's the Declaration of War, I want you to vote for it. Congress adds to the Declaration of War something we call the Teller Amendment. The Teller Amendment specifically said that after the war, Cuba would become an independent country. And so our people who support the war can point to the Declaration and say, look, we said right there, we want Cuba to become an independent country. Therefore, this is not about imperialism. Okay? Secondly, they're going to argue that the destruction of the Maine had to be avenged. Okay? This is the perspective of the Spanish did it, and therefore they must be punished for destroying the Maine, regardless of whether or not they did or not. The public has bought into that, and so we support that idea. The third thing, again, they kind of reiterate. This war is not about imperialism. This war is about doing the right thing, with an asterisk. It's not about imperialism, but what if we did want to be an empire? We could take Spain's if the opportunity presented itself to us. And so, even though this war is not about imperialism, maybe it could be a little bit about imperialism. Okay. Hopefully you read between the lines there. And so, obviously the supporters carry the day, but there are still a large number of people in the United States who did not support the war. They're just not the majority. Please keep that in mind. So the war is going to start, and we're worried about Cuba, and since we're worried about Cuba, where better for the war to start Then the Philippines, all the way on the other side of the world. We're going to go to the Pacific and fight first. On May 1st, 1898, a naval squadron commanded by this guy, George Dewey, is going to attack the Spanish Navy anchored in Manila Bay out in the Philippines. It is a surprise attack, but the declaration of war has already been made, and so this is perfectly legal. And in a 6-hour battle, this U.S. Navy squadron destroys the entire Spanish Pacific Fleet in the Philippines. This is an astounding victory just a few days after the declaration of war. Dewey is a hero in the United States for this. Now, you destroyed the fleet. The Spanish still have soldiers on the Philippine Islands, and so we're going to have to put troops on the islands. That's going to take a lot longer. But in the Philippines, there's also this guy, Emilio Aguinaldo. Emilio Aguinaldo, he's a Filipino, and he's doing the same thing in the Philippines that Jose Marti has been doing in Cuba. He's fighting a revolution, trying to get rid of the Spanish. And he wants to kick the Spanish out. He wants the Philippines to be independent as well. So when the United States declares war on the Spanish, he comes to American advisors there in Asia and says, hey, if you are here to fight the Spanish, I want to help you. And so he and his Filipino revolutionaries will link up with American troops, and they will help fight the Spanish as well. And so you have Americans and Filipinos working together during the war to drive the Spanish out. The only thing he asks is that at the end of the war, the Philippines be given their independence as well. And the American advisors to this, they remind him of the Teller Amendment that says Cuba is going to be independent. And so, why not? Of course, this is about freeing people from a monarchy. Okay. So now we'll come back over here to the Caribbean. What do we need to know about the war over here? Obviously, we invade Cuba. In our invasion of Cuba, there is somebody else that's going to be a hero. A man named Theodore Roosevelt. Depending on what order you studied history in, you may have already seen his name. This is what's going to make Theodore Roosevelt a true national hero. He has already kind of made a name for himself. There are people across the United States that are starting to talk about this guy, but this gives him that immense national popularity. He started the war out as the Assistant Secretary of the Navy. In fact, he was the one that had ordered Dewey to go and prepare to attack the Philippines. But he resigns from that position because Theodore Roosevelt was of the opinion that there's no glory to be had sitting behind a desk. So he resigns his position and joins the Army. And as part of the Army, he's going to help put together a cavalry unit, which is known as the Rough Riders. He actually, on a recruiting venture, he came down to San Antonio, Texas. And he stayed in the Minger Hotel and went to the bar and found cowboys and outlaws and Indian fighters and other kinds of people and signed them up to fight in this cavalry unit alongside his old polo-playing friends from Yale. And if you think those two groups of people wouldn't get along real well, you'd actually be pretty wrong. They got along real well, actually. They were impressed by each other and what they could do with horses. But anyway, they go to Cuba, and this group known as the Rough Riders are going to participate in one of the most famous battles of the war, the Battle of San Juan Hill. This is a famous painting by Frederick Remington of the Battle of San Juan Hill. You see our cavalry unit, which means they ride horses, all on foot, because one of our problems in this war is logistics. The Army forgot to bring their horses. So whatever, they turned into an infantry unit. Up here, leading out in front, though, we have one guy who got a horse. That's one of the officers. That's Theodore Roosevelt, leading from the front. And all the guys that were there at the battle said that was Theodore Roosevelt. He was leading from the front. They participate in this famous battle, and Theodore Roosevelt, never missing an opportunity, actually brought a film crew with him and had them film the battle. The film was then packed up and sent to New York. And he's going to use the popularity off of this battle to help get himself elected governor of New York in the fall elections of 1898. So he knows what he's doing by going out there trying to get all this attention. Later on, of course, the United States is also going to invade Puerto Rico. Once we captured Cuba, we'd invade Puerto Rico because that's another Spanish territory in the Caribbean. And with that, that's it. It's about over. So we're going to end the war with something called the Treaty of Paris, 1898. Yes, another Treaty of Paris. But look on the bright side. This is the last one you got to know. Treaty of Paris, 1898, the one that ends the war between the United States and Spain. And from this cartoon right here, you see Uncle Sam looking out here going, okay, what exactly do I want? Here's our waiter, President McKinley, ready to serve up whatever it is the government wants. Okay? So, Spain surrenders on August 2nd. If you remember, we declared war on April 20th. That's just under a 4-month war. That's pretty good. And so we signed the Treaty of Paris, and the main provisions of the treaty, number one, Cuba gets to be independent. Of course they do. That was in the agreement. That was in the declaration of war. So Cuba gets to be independent. Second, the United States is going to get stuff. What stuff do we get? We get Puerto Rico. We get an island in the Pacific called Guam. We get the Philippines. Wait, what did we promise? We promised the Philippines they'd be independent? They believed us. These are now American territories. And with that, we're done. When the way treaties work in the United States, don't forget, they have to be ratified or approved by the Senate. And so this treaty is brought to the Senate, and the Senate is actually going to add something to the treaty, something called the Platt Amendment. The Platt Amendment changes the relationship that we have with Cuba. In the Platt Amendment, the United States is going to get stuff from Cuba. We're going to get stuff from Cuba too. Okay? The first is we got the right to lease 2 naval bases in Cuba forever. Now, we only ever took one, actually. That's the naval base at Guantanamo Bay. You may be familiar with it. But we got Guantanamo Bay from this Platt Amendment at the end of the Spanish-American War. The second thing that changes is we have the right to veto any foreign policy decision made by the Cuban government. They can make whatever decision they want, but it does have to be approved by us. If we don't like the foreign policy decision they've made, we can veto it, and that's it. It's over. No coming back. The third thing is we reserve the right to intervene in Cuba to, be ready for this phrase, it's going to come up a lot. We can intervene to maintain stability. What does that mean? It means the situation in Cuba is not, in our opinion, stable. And so is there a government that we believe is being oppressive to the people? We can intervene to stop that government. Is there a government that we don't like? We can intervene to remove that government and replace it. This is going to cause a lot of ill will between the United States and Latin America as we did stuff like that over and over and over again. But that'll be later. Okay. So the ultimate impact of the Spanish-American War, probably the most important thing is Cuba becomes something called a protectorate. A protectorate is a country that is technically independent, but someone else is telling them what to do. In this case, the United States is telling Cuba what to do. So they become a protectorate. Okay? There is also one of the reasons we annexed Hawaii in 1898 was because during the war with Spain, there was a fear that other nations would see us as being distracted, and maybe Britain or Germany or someone else would try to annex Hawaii. So we're going to go ahead and get that out of the way because, we must make sure they're protected from other foreign countries. Another impact of the war is what happens in the Philippines afterwards. There will be a revolution. against the American government. There's a revolution in the Philippines, and the United States government has to put this revolution down. And so, how do you put down a revolution in a territory you control? We look back to the last empire that controlled a territory that had a revolution. We look back and use the tactics of Spain in Cuba, including the use of the reconcentrarios, including the use of soldiers going into villages and ransacking people's houses looking for things. This is not our finest hour. Okay? But eventually, the revolution was put down. Also, in 1900, McKinley's going to run for re-election. There are lots of things going on in 1900 that help him out, but winning this war, and winning this war quickly, also helped. If you look at the cartoon over here from Judge magazine, McKinley raising the flag, and the man who's going to challenge him in 1900, the same man who challenged him in 1896, William Jennings Bryan, trying to cut it down. And Uncle Sam over there saying, who do you want? The guy that's going to raise the flag or the guy that's going to bring it down? And another change because of this war, Theodore Roosevelt, he used the popularity from the war to get himself elected governor, and there's a little bit more to it, but he's becoming more popular, and so the Republicans are going to add him to McKinley's ticket as the new vice president to try to help boost the ticket and boost McKinley's chances. McKinley's chances were probably pretty good anyway. Theodore Roosevelt is going to, they think, help push him over the top. Like I said, there's something else going on in there as well, but we'll learn about that later. Things that Theodore Roosevelt has done that have gotten him out of New York. So there it is. Welcome back. We'll put up some newer videos over the next couple of weeks. Thanks for listening.